We see an inmate sitting on a chair in a white room. He is laughing because the interviewers are telling him jokes. There is one-way glass between him and the interviewers, so the inmate can't see them. One of the interviewers stops the jokes and says that the inmate will never get out of here. The inmate still finds it funny and can't stop laughing. It turns out that the interviewers gave him a special drug that will make you laugh at everything. The interviewers are scientists, their names are Steve and Mark. Mark is Steve's assistant. They are in a research facility called Spiderhead. The facility makes all kinds of drugs and tests them on the inmates. The inmates chose to be here instead of a normal prison because of the great living conditions. The scene changes to the main character, Jeff. He wakes up and hears on the radio that he will be the test subject for today. Steve wants to know how Jeff reacts to the outside world and gets him outside the facility. Steve gives Jeff a drug called verbulence. This drug is used by Steve whenever he wants his subjects to express themselves clearly. Jeff gets back inside and sees Lizzie in the kitchen. Everyone in the prison has a job, and their job is making the food. Jeff has a crush on her, but she doesn't feel the same way yet. They talk about the test he just had, and he wants to tell her something important but forgot what it was. When the drug is worn off, you can't really express yourself anymore. In the evening, Jeff lays in bed. He thinks about a party he had in the past. The memory is about himself and his best friend. They are driving in a car, and Jeff is drunk. They crash into a tree and his best friend dies. The memory ends, and the morning comes. We see everyone preparing for the day. Jeff gets into the room where the man from the beginning was getting interviewed. We will call this room the observation room from now on. The other side of the one-way glass is called the viewing room. Steve is in there. A woman walks into Jeff's part of the room, and her name is Heather. Steve asks them to rate each other on attractiveness. Jeff says Heather is a 7 out of 10, and Heather thinks Jeff is a 5 on a good day. Steve asks them to give permission to inject a drug called Luvactin in them. They give permission and Steve asks them to rate each other again. Jeff responds different this time and thinks that she looks perfect now. Heather changed her mind too and says the same thing about Jeff. Steve bumps up the amount of verbulence so they can express themselves better. In a short amount of time, the test subjects get to know each other very well. They both get horny and start having sex. After having a fun time, the subjects are laying on the ground. Jeff says he loves her and she says the same thing back. Before this session, they didn't even know each other's name, so Steve concludes that he just created a love drug. He tells his assistant to observe them for the following days to make sure that the love doesn't wear off. In the next scene, we see Jeff and Lizzie in the kitchen. They finish the food and bring it around. Jeff sees Heather again. They make eye contact but are not attracted to each other anymore. Jeff is back in the observation room and another woman comes in. Her name is Sarah. Steve gives them the love drug again and they have sex. A little bit later, Jeff is talking to Mark. Mark is putting new drugs in the drug injector on Jeff's back. Jeff says that he doesn't want to work in the kitchen anymore and asks if he can change jobs with someone. Mark says that's okay and he leaves. Then we see Sarah and Heather sitting in the observation room. Jeff is in the viewing room with Steve and Mark. Steve gives him a dilemma. He needs to inject one of the girls with a drug called Darkaflox and he needs to choose which girl it will be. Darkaflox gives you great dread and severe anxiety. Steve gives this dilemma to test which woman Jeff is more attracted to and if the love drug has something to do with it. The love drug has worn out and Jeff says that he doesn't have a preference. Steve thinks Jeff is holding something back but he doesn't press further. He notices that Jeff is sad and asks why. Jeff just wants redemption for what happened to his best friend in the car crash. Steve responds and says that he gets his redemption if he keeps letting Steve test his drugs on him. The inmates have free time and Jeff is talking with Lizzie when they get interrupted by some guards. One day in the week, Jeff can go outside the facility to talk with his girlfriend on the phone. He is calling her, but we hear her voicemail. He leaves a message, but the telephone says that her inbox is full. The scene changes to Jeff sitting in the observation room. A buff guy named Rogan comes in, and Jeff thinks that Steve will inject the love drug into them. Steve comforts him and says that that isn't the case. The guys are waiting for Steve to do something, but after a while he says that the session is over and that they can leave. Jeff gets into the viewing room and we see Heather. Steve gave her the same Darkaflox dilemma as Jeff had. Jeff is angry, but Steve says he was assigned to do this by his boss. He tells Jeff that it is a privilege to be here instead of a normal jail and he should be grateful for it. Jeff says sorry and Steve accepts it. Next, we see Steve and his assistant walking in the building. Steve says that over a week all the tests will be completed and they can fill in the last stars. Mark isn't happy with the Darkaflux dilemma, and Steve says that it is important so they can really figure out what is going on in the brain of the test subjects. We see Jeff sitting with Lizzie. Lizzie says that Mark talked to her and said that Jeff didn't want to work in the kitchen anymore. She asks why, but he can't explain himself. He says that she isn't the problem, and the scene changes. We see that Steve has a drug injector on his back too. He wants Mark to inject him with one of the drugs. Mark says that the drugs should be taken at least 12 hours apart, but Steve says that he invented it and knows what he is doing. Shortly after, Jeff gets in the viewing room because he has an appointment with the scientists. Heather gets in the observation room and Steve tells her to wait for a bit. Steve says that his boss didn't like Jeff's previous answer on the Darkaflux dilemma. So, they need to do it again. This time, they will test how Jeff reacts when one of the girls gets injected with it. Jeff doesn't want this, but Steve says that Heather did bad things before she was put here. He still doesn't want to see Heather get injected and asks Steve to call his boss to talk him out of it. Steve gets out of the room and pretends to talk to his boss, but he is just killing the time by talking to Lizzie. He gets back in the room and says that his boss didn't want to change his opinion. He also says that when Jeff doesn't comply, the boss will send him to a normal prison. Jeff doesn't want this and agrees to watch Heather get injected with the drug. Heather is tripping out, but Steve doesn't care because this test is about how Jeff reacts to seeing her. Steve gives Jeff some verbulence and asks him if he loves her. Jeff says no, and Heather is still going crazy. She backs up and her drug injector hits the wall. It breaks and she gets an overdose of Darkaflux in her body. She kills herself, and the scientists get to the corpse. Jeff sees a key on the ground that Steve dropped when rushing to Heather. He opens a locked drawer and sees the notes of Steve. He checks all the notes and sees Abnesti Pharmaceuticals as a letterhead. The last name of Steve is Abnesti, and Jeff now knows that Steve doesn't have a boss and he lied to him. He also sees a bingo card with stars on it. The card is almost full and only needs 2 more stars to complete it. The numbers uncovered on the card are 40 and 6. 40 is the number of the love drug, and 6 is the number of a new drug called a BDX. A BDX makes you obey every command that someone gives to you. Steve gets back to the room, and Jeff puts the notebook away just in time. Mark says to Steve that they should report Heather's death to the police. Steve doesn't think this is a good idea, so they don't do it. Steve is taking Heather's stuff out of her room and is mad that this happened. He sees Jeff sitting in his room and says that in science, you need to have losers to make the bigger wins. He also says that they are here to help humanity, and sometimes there are unforeseen things that can happen. Jeff says that he gets it, and Steve asks him if he can get him something to feel better. In the next scene, we see Steve and Jeff in the room of Steve. Steve injected himself and Jeff with the laugh drug. They are having a great time and Jeff feels better. Next, we see Lizzie in the observation room. She has been injected with a drug named phobia. That drug will make you scared of even the smallest things. In her case, she is scared to death by a stapler. Jeff and Lizzie are talking about the session she had, and she says that she is ashamed for fearing such a small item. He tells her that he is ashamed too of what happens in the sessions with the scientist. This is the reason why Jeff wanted to get out of the kitchen job, because he didn't want her to notice that he didn't like it in the facility. Lizzie is questioning if this place is even better than a normal prison. And she asks why Jeff is still here. He says that this is worse, but deserves to be here for killing his friend in the car accident. He is sad and Lizzie hugs him. Jeff is laying in his bed and Steve is watching him with his camera. He zooms in and sees a drawing of Lizzie next to his bed. He says bingo and goes to sleep. The following day Jeff is in the viewing room because he has an appointment with Steve. Steve says that his boss wants him to do another test with Darkaflux. He then gives Jeff the device where you can inject the drugs with. The window is covered and Jeff asks who is in the other room. Steve reveals that it is Lizzie. Jeff says that he is not going to inject the drug into her, but Steve says that this is the last time anyone ever gets the drug injected into themselves. Jeff gets angry and is still not doing it. Steve says that they will continue this session in the morning so Jeff can change his mind. When Jeff is out of the room, Steve says to his assistant to double his dose of the obey drug. The assistant gets in Jeff's room and Jeff knows what he is doing. He says that he knows that Steve is the owner of the company and is lying to everyone. He also says that Steve isn't here to make the world better, but only wants to make the obey drug perfect. So that he can make everyone obey his commands. Jeff asks him why he would work for a man like Steve, and Mark says that he is a genius and that Steve said that they would change the world together. It is the following day, and it's time for Jeff to darkaflox Lizzie. He looks at her and still won't do it. Steve is furious and slams his hands on the desk. He tells Jeff that Lizzie lied to him about the reason she is here. The reason is that Lizzie forgot her baby in her car and went to work. When she came back, the baby was dead from the heat. She got filed with reckless endangerment and manslaughter and got sent to prison. She cries and says that she didn't intend to do that. Lizzie is still mad at herself and says that whatever Jeff has to inject in her, he needs to do it. He injects it, and we see Steve laughing. Instead of injecting Lizzie, Jeff switched the profiles on the device and can inject Steve with whatever drug he wants. He switches from the laughing drug to phobia, and Steve gets scared of Jeff. He then injects Steve with darkaflox. Jeff says that Mark is getting the police and that they will arrive at any moment. Jeff takes the notes of Steve and picks up the bingo card. He asks him why the obeyed drug doesn't have a star on it yet. Steve says that it can make you obey someone. But when your unconscious thinks a task is too crazy, it still won't work. Jeff is mad because he and the other inmates thought it was their own choice to be here. But it was the drug that made them think that. Steve reveals that Jeff's sentence was already over and he was free to go 7 months ago. Jeff gets even madder and slams Steve's head into his desk. He says to open the door of the facility, and Steve does this. He walks away when Steve takes a knife and gets the drug inject device back. He darkafloxes Lizzie and slams the device into the wall. The device breaks and Lizzie gets an overdose of darkaflox injected into her. The two boys get into a fight and Steve chokes Jeff. The darkaflox is making Lizzie crazy and she chokes herself too. Jeff gets out of the chokehold and takes the knife. He runs to the observation room and frees Lizzie from her own choke. He gets the darkaflox out of her drug injector and she is saved. They try to escape the facility and Steve tells the other inmates that there is a breakout. They don't want to go back to a normal prison and will do everything to stay here. The first prisoners get to them and they fight. Jeff and Lizzie win it, but more are coming. In the meantime, we see Steve escaping the facility because the police will arrest him if he stays here. He gets into his plane and flies away. We see the duo again. They get to the main door of the facility and lock it behind them so the other inmates won't follow them. The inmates still manage to break the door and are on their trail. Steve just left with the plane, so the duo takes a boat to get away instead. Steve's injection device is broken because of the fight he had with Jeff before. All the drugs get in his system and he can't fly anymore. He crashes into a mountain and dies. We see the duo on the boat and they have successfully escaped the facility. Thank you for watching the movie Spiderhead with us. If you liked it, subscribe.